Today's episode involves discussion of a case revolving around sexual assault and abuse which some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. On a warm and muggy summer night in August of 1974, 17-year-old Leslie Zaret went missing. A native of Queens, New York, Leslie knew the area well and frequently walked long distances unaccompanied. However, on Friday, August 16th, she vanished while walking the 26 blocks from her best friend's house to her family home, a trip she had taken countless times before. 6 hours later, her family reported her missing, and within just 4 hours, they were called down to the police station to identify her body. At approximately 8:20 a.m., a local custodian employed by Public School 203 contacted authorities to report the discovery of a body. Detectives quickly determined that the victim had been sexually assaulted and murdered. While investigators initially theorized that the 17-year-old may have been killed by someone she knew, evidence would mount, pointing in a completely different direction. For more than 30 years, Leslie's case grew cold until a 3-star NYPD chief, a highly respected lieutenant, and an investigator lauded for his shrewd skills and memory began digging back in. What they would uncover completely changed the shape of the case and, for the first time, introduced a suspect who operated with a very similar MO at the same time. All these years later, they still need your help to bring Leslie's killer to justice. This is Trace Evidence, Episode 218, The Murder of Leslie Zaret. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the brutal and disturbing murder and sexual assault of 17-year-old Leslie Zaret. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. As a final note, this year, CrimeCon will be taking place in Orlando, Florida from September 22nd through the 24th. I'll be there representing Trace Evidence on Podcast Row, and I hope to see you too. Visit crimecon.com and use promo code TRACE to save 10% on your pass. That's crimecon.com, promo code TRACE. Nearly 50 years ago, 17-year-old Leslie Zaret began her walk home and never arrived. Despite the passage of all that time, investigators have never been closer to finding an answer. This is episode 218, The Murder of Leslie Zaret. Leslie Sue Zaret was born on Saturday, September 22, 1956 in Queens, New York to parents David and Charlotte. Leslie was the Zaret's second child, with her having an older sister, Melissa, who was born 3 years earlier. Leslie would be raised in Queens, the largest New York City borough in terms of area, located on the western end of Long Island. Queens has always had a large and burgeoning population with massive expansion noted over a 4-decade period, where the population increased more than 4 times over between 1920 and 1960. By the dawning of 1970, when Leslie was 14 years old, the population had exploded to nearly 2 million residents. Were Queens a city today, it would be the 4th most populous in the United States behind only New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago. What little is known about Leslie's childhood and upbringing seems to be encapsulated within statements of both family and friends who described the young woman as a smart, loving, and hardworking teen with a strong vision towards her future. Leslie's family has been described as deeply devout in their Judaism, and Leslie was raised through the combined teachings of her family and the temple. The family home was described as a loving environment in which David and Charlotte cared deeply for their daughters, wanted the best for them, and were extremely proud of their children's accomplishments. Living with her family along 68th Drive in the Flushing section of Queens, Leslie would attend John Bone High School. Located along Main Street and just over half a mile from her family's home, Leslie frequently walked the quick 13-minute route each morning and afternoon. Her familiarity with Queens expanded as she grew older, with her venturing further out. Whether she was visiting friends, going to the movies, or dropping in at a party, she knew the area like the back of her hand. In the last 2 years of her time at John Bone, she developed a close friendship with Laura Gold. Utilizing the Long Island Expressway as a dividing line, Leslie lived just south of the LIE, while Laura was located to the north. The distance between the two young women's homes was approximately 1.4 miles, and it was an area that they both would become familiar traversing. As their friendship developed, the two began spending more time together, and Leslie frequently found herself making the walk north to spend time at Laura's home on 58th Avenue. She made the walk dozens of times at all hours of day and night, so much so that she had a specific route she stuck to as she traveled the 26 blocks from home to home. It had become a normal part of Leslie's routine, one she didn't fear nor hesitate to embark upon. But then one warm summer night in August of 1974, Leslie stepped out onto the sidewalk to begin the trek home, but never made it. Somewhere amidst those 26 blocks, she found herself in the sights of a killer. In June of 1974, 17-year-old Leslie graduated from John Bone High School and picked up work at IBM, where her job was listed as a key punch operator. Essentially, back in the day when many computers utilized punch cards for programs and operations, Leslie would utilize a key punch to create those program cards. It was a decent entry-level job for the driven and intelligent 17-year-old who had already enrolled in college. That September, not long before what would have been her 18th birthday, Leslie was set to begin classes at Queens College. Sadly, the 17-year-old wouldn't make it to college, nor would she see her 18th birthday. Just 2 months after graduating high school, she would vanish on her walk home, only for her body to be discovered hours later, more than 6 miles from her normal route. The morning of Friday, August 16th, 1974, was a warm and humid day in Queens. Following the sunrise that morning at 6:38 a.m., the humidity of the previous night began declining but remained high. The sticky air was disrupted only slightly when light winds sailed in from the Atlantic Ocean, sweeping up from the South Shore. For the most part, it appears, this was a fairly normal Friday in the Zaret home. While there have been no statements issued nor timelines given about Leslie's comings and goings through the early part of the day, law enforcement has suggested that they are unaware of any incidents or encounters which may have disturbed or concerned the 17-year-old. According to initial reports by the New York Daily News, Leslie ventured over to Laura's home sometime that afternoon or early evening and spent several hours hanging out with her friend. As the night grew short, Leslie decided it was time to make the long walk back to her home, 26 blocks to the south. Originally, it was reported that Leslie picked up the phone at Laura's home around 11:30 p.m., at which time she called her home, telling her father that she was on her way. However, David Zaret would later deny this call ever came, noting that not only was he at work at the time, so he couldn't have been home to answer the phone, but also adding that had his daughter planned to walk home that night and that distance, he would have either gone and picked her up or sent a taxi. Over the years, it has been clearly established that no such call was made, though where this particular detail originated from has never been determined. Instead, it seems, what actually happened was that Leslie didn't come home that night, and her parents, never having had any issues with her staying out past curfew, became concerned with each passing hour. Finally, 6 hours after Leslie is alleged to have left the home on 58th Avenue at 5:17 a.m., David Zaret picked up the phone to report his daughter missing. Despite the urgency in the call and her parents' overwhelming worry, it would take police more than an hour to arrive at the home and take the report. Even after taking it, it would later be stated that there didn't appear to be any great concern from police who at the time assumed the 17-year-old had gone out partying with friends and had fallen asleep somewhere, or may have chosen not to come home for reasons of her own. The Zarets strongly denied these possibilities, but it doesn't seem as though their worries were taken to heart. Just over 2 hours later, at approximately 8:20 a.m., 34-year-old custodian Saul Rempf arrived for work at the Oakland Gardens School, also known as PS 203. There, in an alley between the school and the playground, he came upon a disturbing scene. Lying on the concrete was the nude and lifeless body of Leslie Zaret. Rempf, panicked by what he had just discovered, spotted a man walking his dog and asked him to watch over the scene as he rushed to call police. Within minutes, several patrol officers had arrived and, not long after, detectives were on the scene. Police records would later show that, at the time of their arrival, detectives found the 17-year-old lying flat on her back, completely nude but for several pieces of jewelry: a gold chain around her neck, gold earrings, and 2 gold rings. It seemed apparent that this was unlikely to have been a robbery gone wrong. What really stood out to detectives wasn't necessarily the way the body had been left, but instead, what else was there? Neatly folded and stacked beside her body were the clothes she had been wearing the night before: a long-sleeve flower print blouse, blue jeans, and beige platform shoes. The only outwardly identifiable trauma to the body was seen on her neck, where they spotted several scratches, leading them to theorize that she had been killed via manual strangulation. While at the time they wouldn't get into specific details, detectives did note they had found what they described as evidence of a sexual assault. It was also noted that no purse or handbag was located at the scene. Robin Graff, then assistant medical examiner, was called down to the scene to conduct an analysis before removal of the body. From that initial exam, Graff would agree with detectives that it appeared the cause of death was strangulation, but no official word would be released until a full autopsy could be conducted. Detectives then began speaking with Saul Rempf, who had found the body, at which time he explained that this particular location was a known hangout for local teens who often came to drink, smoke pot, hook up, and party. Rempf later told the Daily News, quote, "I come here sometimes and I see them running naked through the playground." End quote. At the time, detectives didn't have an ID on the remains, and so they weren't yet questioning exactly how Leslie had come to be in the playground area. In hopes of finding answers, they sent officers to canvass a 5-block area around the school and playground, thinking that perhaps someone may have heard or seen something. Unfortunately, what they would quickly learn is that, since that area was such a hotspot for local teens, neighbors were always hearing loud noises and screams. One neighbor, titled in the paper as Miss Leon Messer, told the news that even if she'd heard screaming that night, she wouldn't have suspected anything out of the ordinary, saying, quote, "I hear all kinds of noise down there 2 or 3 nights a week, and in the morning, there are bottles and debris all over the place." End quote. According to other neighbors, they'd been complaining about the teens partying and gathering in the area for months, but law enforcement didn't seem to have any interest in breaking it up. Stephen Singer, a lawyer living in the neighborhood, told the Daily News, quote, "Kids from 13 to 19 use the schoolyard for beer, pot, and sex parties. It's become a haven for them. You come by in the morning, and the area is literally covered with broken beer bottles. The cops haven't been able to get rid of the kids despite constant complaints from neighborhood residents. They're not outsiders. They're kids from the neighborhood." End quote. While they had become somewhat accustomed to the loud noises, screams, laughter, and the crashing of broken bottles, locals had never expected something like this to happen. Many residents expressed their concern and urged the police to keep a tighter eye on the spot, noting that it always seemed like no one cared about these types of complaints until after something terrible happened, almost like it's a requirement for action. A toxic cocktail of frustration, fear, and anger began spreading, and by the end of the day, locals were demanding swift justice. Leslie's body was taken away at this time so that an autopsy could be conducted. It was also around this time that investigators on the scene became aware of the missing persons report filed that morning by David Zaret. At approximately 11:30 a.m., 6 hours after reporting their daughter missing, David and Charlotte were called down to the Fresh Meadows police station, where they were able to positively identify their daughter from photos taken at the scene. It was a gut-wrenching blow to the close-knit family, who couldn't begin to wrap their heads around how someone could have committed such an atrocious act. Of course, There was another more pressing question that flooded to the forefront of their minds. Who did this? Unfortunately, that answer would prove difficult to find. Detective Pat Kelly took on the case. Kelly had a reputation for being a devoted investigator and was deeply focused on clearing every case that came across his desk. Following the canvass of the area, which produced no solid leads or information, detectives began digging into Leslie's life. They interviewed friends and family, though no one was able to provide any helpful information, as they were unaware of anyone who may have been after Leslie, and reportedly, she herself had never expressed any concerns or worries about anyone. Given the nature of the crime, it was soon theorized that Leslie might have been abducted somewhere along her walk home. Perhaps she even had gotten into a vehicle with someone she knew or was forced in by an assailant. In hopes of determining what might have happened, detectives began canvassing along the route Leslie frequently used to travel home. Beginning at Laura Gold's family's apartment at 148 18 58th Avenue, it's believed that Leslie would have walked west along 58th Avenue until she came to Main Street, at which time she would have turned left, heading south. According to everyone who knew Leslie, her route would have then simply carried her south along Main Street, over the Long Island Expressway, past her former high school, and to her home on 68th Drive. Part of this route would have carried Leslie past Mount Hebron Cemetery, a massive graveyard that is home to more than 217,000 graves. The eastern edge of the cemetery runs along a 5-block stretch of Main Street where there was little light and no homes, described by investigators as a dark, desolate 5-block stretch. Detectives theorized that this 5-block area may have been where Leslie was abducted, as there was unlikely to have been anyone around to hear her cries for help, nor to assist her had she tried to escape. For one reason or another, the possibility that Leslie could have known her attacker wasn't considered very likely, with Lieutenant Charles McGowan of the Queens Homicide Unit telling the Daily News, quote, "Her parents waited all night for her to arrive and called us early this morning when she didn't show. A few hours later, we were called by the school custodian who reported that he had spotted a young woman apparently ill behind the school. There is a very good possibility she did not know her killer." End quote. Additional canvassing along the route Leslie would have taken allowed investigators to establish somewhat of a timeline based on eyewitness sightings of the 17-year-old. Reportedly, she left Laura Gold's home at approximately 11:30 p.m. Had she traveled straight to her home, she should have arrived no later than midnight. However, detectives did uncover a deviation in Leslie's typical route. On the night of her murder, Leslie had stopped by a bar located at 5920 Main Street, approximately 0.4 of a mile southwest from Laura's home. Reportedly, Leslie made this stop around 11:35 p.m. in order to see if her boyfriend was present as he worked at the bar. I should note, there's never been any real specificity given to this boyfriend, nor has his name ever been shared. As a result, there is some uncertainty as to whether or not this was someone Leslie was currently in a relationship with, someone she had previously dated, or just a boy who was also a friend. The bar was located on the corner of Main Street and 60th Avenue, meaning that after leaving, Leslie could have simply turned south and been right back on her normal route, finding herself just shy of 1 mile from home. Now in possession of this new information, detectives were able to narrow their field a little more. They updated their information, noting that Leslie was believed to have encountered her assailant sometime between 11:35 and midnight. Mount Hebron Cemetery, noted as being the location from which investigators believe she was abducted, was located just short of halfway between the bar and her home. While this fell in line with what investigators had previously theorized, they still had a big gaping hole when it came to a potential suspect. Not only did they have no suspect description, they had no information about a vehicle or how or why he may have encountered or specifically sought after Leslie. Some, in later years, would theorize that perhaps the killer was in the bar that night and targeted Leslie purely because she was out walking alone. On Sunday, August 19th, 2 days after Leslie's body was found, an autopsy was conducted by Assistant Chief Medical Examiner Dominic DeMaio. He concluded that Leslie had died as the result of asphyxiation caused by manual strangulation. DeMaio stated that additional testing was being conducted in order to determine whether or not she had been sexually assaulted. Detective Captain Roy Richter, asked about the investigation thus far, told the Daily News that they believed Leslie was forced into a vehicle and driven east along the Long Island Expressway to Bayside, where her body was found. It's interesting to note that PS 203 is nowhere along Leslie's route, and the school is actually 6 miles east from where she was last spotted at the bar on Main Street. Detective Richter also noted that they had set up a dedicated hotline in hopes of receiving tips from the local community. While investigators did receive some tips, none of them appeared to have led them any closer to a suspect. The community, reacting to the horror of the crime, began demanding an increased law enforcement presence in the area of PS 203 and the playground on which local teens had been gathering and partying. In addition to this, a spokesman from the Parks Department noted many requests had been made to institute a 10 p.m. curfew on that property. The same day that Leslie's autopsy was conducted, Ralph Winston, president of the Oakland Hills Community Association, was joined by State Senator Frank Padovan to examine and survey the area surrounding the playground. Winston noted his belief that the killer had to have been familiar with the area, as the location where Leslie was found is surrounded by a locked chain-link fence. Winston stated that the killer was obviously aware of several holes in the fence, found along Springfield Boulevard, suggesting that he had either been there before or was familiar enough to know the way in. Winston explained, quote, "He had to be. There are holes in the fence, and he must have known about them to get the girl behind the school." End quote. There seemed to be somewhat of a disagreement about the suspect, with some members of law enforcement believing that he was completely unknown to Leslie, while others thought she might only have gotten into a vehicle if she knew the driver. Sadly, like so many horrible crimes that are left unsolved, Leslie's story began falling from the headlines. The 17-year-old was quietly laid to rest in Wellwood Cemetery in West Babylon, New York. Her stone reads, "Always in our hearts, Leslie Sue Zaret, beloved daughter and sister." For the Zaret family, it never became any easier, and the slow passage of time with no answers, no arrests, and no solid suspects only made it that more difficult. The family withdrew into themselves, keeping their grief private, as multiple articles would later state that they did not wish to offer any comments about the investigation or Leslie's murder. Leslie's name would not return to the headlines again until 32 years later, nearly twice as long as she had been alive. August of 2006 marked 32 years since Leslie Zaret was murdered and left nude in the playground behind PS 203. Whether it had anything to do with the anniversary or not, cold case detectives announced that they had received a call which caught their interest. 6 years earlier, a special reunion was held for the graduating classes of John Bone High School between the years of 1970 and 1975. Leslie graduated in 74. According to a tipster, there were multiple conversations held at the reunion about Leslie's unsolved murder. NYPD Deputy Chief Joseph Resnick explained their interest, telling the New York Post, quote, "This is on someone's conscience. We want to know what was discussed. Did they discuss a suspect? If so, who were they discussing? This was a young, attractive, well-liked individual whose life was violently taken from her." End quote. In hopes that someone would remember something or have new information to add, the NYPD sent out letters to all of the alumni who attended the reunion. This reunion, held in Boca Raton, Florida in October of 2000, welcomed approximately 300 previous graduates. Why exactly police did not receive this tip until nearly 6 years after the reunion is unknown, but detectives were hoping to pick up a few names of potential persons of interest to dig into. The letter they sent read, in part, quote, "We are asking for your help. It is our hope that your information, regardless of how trivial in nature you believe it to be, together with new technology, may be beneficial in solving this crime." End quote. During this same interview with Chief Resnick, a piece of information was revealed which had not been previously released. According to Resnick, investigators are in possession of DNA, which they obtained from a hairbrush recovered at the crime scene. It would later be revealed that the hairbrush was in fact a key piece of evidence in the case, as when detectives first arrived on the scene in 1974, their attention was immediately drawn to it, as it appeared the killer had gone above and beyond to make it apparent. According to official statements from investigators, aside from the fact that Leslie had been found nude, her body had apparently been posed by her killer. Her legs were splayed open, and the hairbrush was found inside of her, the handle clearly jutting out from between her legs. This seems to explain why there was initially so much discussion of sexual assault, but no additional information about a potential rape. Detectives would later state there was no evidence of sexual intercourse or forcible rape beyond the sexual assault conducted with that hairbrush. Leslie's case would be reopened by cold case investigators following a truly strange experience for a high-ranking member of the NYPD. Three-star NYPD Chief Joanne Jaffe had a disturbing dream one night about a young woman being sexually assaulted with a hairbrush and then murdered. When she woke the next day, she wasn't quite sure if she was remembering a real event or had merely had a disturbing dream. However, having grown up in Bayside, Queens, she felt there was something more to this. According to an article from the Daily Beast, Jaffe placed a call to a friend in the Queens District Attorney's office. While this friend couldn't remember anything specific, she agreed to reach out to Judge Greg Lasak, previously the head of the DA's office's homicide unit. Lasak got into contact with former Detective Pat Kelly, who had worked Leslie's case. Then, in his 80s, Kelly's memory wasn't as sharp as it had once been, but he was able to deliver several details about the case and even suggested that DNA might be something that could finally solve it. Now, knowing the case was real and having a name to go with it, Chief Jaffe wanted to see what could be done. At the time of the murder, Jaffe herself was only 16 years old and had frequented the PS 203 playground. For her, it was personal. It wasn't just about solving a horrible crime, but it was about finding justice for a young woman who on any other night and any other time could have just as easily have been Jaffe herself. Jaffe's next step was to review the work of previous investigators to determine what had been done and perhaps more importantly, what hadn't. While she had been advised that it would be difficult to track down case files and evidence from so long ago, Chief Jack Travis lent a hand, and together they managed to recover several boxes of notes and reports in addition to the infamous hairbrush. In response to the finding of the files and this new invigoration for the investigation, Queens Cold Case Squad Lieutenant Phil Panzarella, known by his nickname Sundance, assigned Detective Mark Valencia to the cold case. Valencia was known throughout the department for both his dogged tenacity and his impeccable memory. He told the Daily Beast, quote, "They used to joke and call me Rain Man. I never, ever, ever quit. Never." End quote. Jaffe was thrilled with Valencia's assignment, having heard much of his reputation. As Valencia took on the case and began the work of backtracking through the investigation, one that was conducted more than 3 decades earlier, he kept in close contact with Jaffe. The two frequently spoke about developments, leads, and new directions to pursue. Valencia's first major step was to visit the 111th Precinct Station House, which covers the Bayside area in which Leslie's body was found. There, Valencia read through forms previously filled out by Detective Kelly, who had chronicled the entire investigation meticulously. Valencia read all about the discovery of Leslie's body, the disturbing details about the hairbrush, and several details which had been presented to officers by Saul Remph, the custodian who had originally found her body. Remph told the officers that the playground was locked during off hours and that whoever had brought Leslie to that spot must have been aware of holes cut in the fence along the far side of the yard, adjacent to a wooded area between the playground and Queensboro Community College. Unfortunately, the note showed how much of a dead end original investigators had run into. No helpful information from any of their canvassing, nothing that gave a clue as to who may have perpetrated this heinous crime. However, Valencia did come across a list of potential suspects that had previously been interviewed. One of them caught his eye, this being a then 21-year-old man who was living on Long Island. Perhaps the detail that drew him in was that this suspect had been arrested for a sexual assault 2 weeks to the day before Leslie's murder, less than 5 miles from where her body had been found. According to the files, when investigators went to this man's home to question him about Leslie in 1974, they encountered a curious scene. Reportedly, the man had packed his bags and purchased an airline ticket for a flight to California. This was very bizarre since the man had an upcoming court date for the rape charge, and fleeing the state would have had him forfeiting the bail money that his parents had put up. Ultimately, he didn't flee and went on to plead guilty, serving 17 months in state prison. While this sounds like a very good suspect, detectives in 1974 weren't sure. They believed that the rape was too different from what happened to Leslie, stating that it was more like a quote-unquote date rape than a stranger abduction and sexual assault. In hopes of learning more about the suspect, Valencia managed to track down the first victim and asked her if she would be willing to walk him through what happened to her that horrible night. The woman told Valencia she had encountered her assailant at a Manhattan rock club. Club 82 had a notorious history, previously belonging to the wife of famed mobster Vito Genovese. It had changed much over the years and then presented upcoming rock and punk bands. According to the woman, the assailant asked her if she could give him a ride home, and she agreed. The two drove out of Manhattan into Queens, at which time they stopped at the Hilltop Diner, located at 16402 Union Turnpike, 1.3 miles southeast of Leslie's home and just 1.5 miles from the location where detectives believe she was forced into or willingly got into her killer's car. The woman went on to tell Valencia that the man had asked her if she was interested in picking up some pot to smoke, and at the time she agreed. He directed her to Cunningham Park in Fresh Meadows, 1.8 miles southwest from where Leslie's body was found. The woman explained that once they walked into the park, she realized something was wrong and that this man wasn't taking her to purchase pot, but instead leading her to a secluded spot where there was no one who could help her. The woman explained that right when this started to sink in, the man lunged at her, knocking her to the ground, jumping on top of her. He began tearing off her clothes and attempted to rape the victim. However, he was unable to achieve or maintain an erection. Then the woman told Valencia something she had never told anyone before, a detail so upsetting that she had kept it hidden for more than 30 years, a detail which will forever link her assault to Leslie's murder. The woman told Valencia that when the rapist failed to get an erection, he violently rolled her over onto her stomach, grabbed her comb, and thrust it into her rectum. Moments later, the suspect rolled her onto her back and had seemingly gotten an erection from this grotesque violation. At that point, the man began raping her, and all throughout he had his hands around her throat, gripping tighter and tighter. Certain that she was going to be murdered, the woman fought hard and managed to knee him in the groin, fleeing into the night as he collapsed to the ground. She got herself to a hospital from which she reported the sexual assault and received treatment. The woman confirmed to Valencia through tears that she had been interviewed by detectives back in 1974, but that she had felt too ashamed and embarrassed to mention the comb aspect of the assault. This new information really ignited a flame inside of Valencia, who turned his attention towards the man who pleaded guilty to raping this woman. Now, I can't reveal the name of this suspect despite how much I would really like to. However, in the interest of simplicity, I'm going to begin referring to him as Mr. Softy. Valencia theorized that Softy may have been out trolling the Queens area that night when he came across Leslie walking home by herself. At that point, there's no certainty, but Valencia theorized that Softy either forced Leslie into his car or perhaps, similar to his first victim, may have offered some pot or asked if she wanted a ride to go pick some up. Valencia noted that while this sounds out of the realm of rationality today, you have to keep in mind that this was the 70s. From there, it was theorized that Softy may have driven Leslie to an isolated location where he repeated the assault he had done to the first victim. Valencia noted that victim number 1 was larger and stronger than Leslie, who, at 5 feet 1 inch tall and 105 pounds, may have been viewed by Softy as an easier target because he's a wimp. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Investigators over the years have never been specific about how they believe Leslie came to be in the playground that night. It seemed apparent to them that the crime had not been committed at that location and that Leslie had likely been killed elsewhere and then her body staged by the killer. Valencia stated his belief that Leslie's body was likely in the trunk of Softy's car following the crime, at which point he drove home and parked in his family's garage. He then asked to borrow his father's car and drove directly to Manhattan's Club 82, where he initiated a fight. Valencia theorizes that this fight was agitated in order to give Softy an alibi for his whereabouts that night. After this, Softy would have returned home, switched cars, and drove out to Bayside, where he posed her body, stacked her clothing neatly beside her, and assaulted her with the hairbrush. In Valencia's mind, the entire crime was a message from Softy, his way of saying that he had to escalate things to this point because his first victim had escaped. Returning to the original case files, Valencia discovered an interview detectives had conducted with Softy's girlfriend in 1974. She stated that Softy came to her apartment the night of Leslie's murder and reeked with the foul odor of human feces. In deaths caused by manual strangulation, the victim will often lose control of their bowels, and this stench on Softy made Valencia believe that he had been involved in something horrible that night. More than 30 years later, he managed to track down this same woman, and as soon as he introduced himself as a detective, the woman stated that she knew he was there to talk about Softy. When Valencia asked why she would think that was his reason for being there, the woman allegedly replied, "Because he killed that girl." Valencia would go on to interview 5 other women who had encounters with Softy. All of them gave accounts of abuse and assault at his hands, with the attacks becoming more violent and brutal the longer they went on. Now, with this suspect locked firmly in his mind, Valencia brought all of the information he'd uncovered to his boss, Lieutenant Panzarella. Since there was little else which could be done to find new information, Panzarella advised Valencia to bring Softy in for questioning under the hope that he might say something to advance their case or, better yet, incriminate himself. Valencia and his partner pulled Softy over near where he was living at the time, outside of the city. Valencia agreed to accompany the men to answer some questions, but once he saw them heading towards Queens, he no longer wanted to go, saying that he needed to pick his daughter up from school. Instead, they convinced Softy to go with them to a nearby police station where they began speaking with him. During the interview, he was given a cup of water, and investigators hoped to get his DNA from it, but according to Valencia, Softy hung on to that cup for dear life, even after it was empty, almost as if he knew that they couldn't take it from him unless he voluntarily left it behind. Suddenly, in the midst of questioning, Softy got angry and jumped up from his seat, slamming his hands down on the table and demanding to be released, leaving the cup behind. As Valencia walked Softy out, he offered him a ride home, but Softy wouldn't go for it. According to Valencia, when he pointed out that it was a very cold day, Softy replied, quote, "I'm going to walk. I need the air. Besides, I'm not getting back in your car because I know I'm never getting out." End quote. Now, they were in possession of Softy's DNA. However, they had no solid genetic evidence from the scene of the crime with which to compare it to. Although they had previously noted DNA being recovered from the hairbrush, it's never been explained why a comparison couldn't be made. Perhaps the evidence wasn't handled properly. Considering DNA wasn't a thing in 1974, this wouldn't be surprising. Although some have theorized that while DNA evidence was recovered, it may not have been enough to generate a full profile. In regard to that, until investigators give more information, it's all pure speculation. After the interview, Softy hired a prominent Queens defense attorney and refused to speak with investigators again under advice of counsel. This left detectives in a position where they couldn't question Softy further unless his lawyer agreed, and as it seems, he never did. Running out of avenues to explore, Valencia was ready to make a desperate plea. The only chance they had to possibly uncover DNA evidence lie in the grave with Leslie. After speaking with the Queens District Attorney's Office, they decided to approach the Zaret family to request permission to exhume her body. Leslie's father, David, passed away in 1995, and so they turned to her mother, Charlotte. It was a difficult process to convince her, as Valencia commented, quote, "You try to convince a Jewish family to exhume someone who's been buried for 32 years." End quote. Ultimately, Charlotte agreed under a specific set of terms, asking that Leslie be exhumed for only 1 day and that her gravesite be returned to its pre-exhumation conditions. Valencia promised they would do everything properly and ultimately drove Charlotte and her brother to the West Babylon Cemetery. He wanted Charlotte to see the grave before the exhumation so that after she was returned to the earth, she'd see that things were set back to the way they had been. On the day of the exhumation, Leslie's remains were taken to the Queen's Medical Examiner's office. A forensic anthropologist managed to recover some scrapings from beneath Leslie's fingernails for DNA analysis. Leslie was then returned to the cemetery for reburial. A prosecutor, who is also Jewish, was present and said Kaddish, the Jewish prayer of mourning, as she was recommitted to the earth. Everyone stood by in respectful silence, with even the gravediggers removing their hats and bowing their heads. To Detective Valencia, it was a highly emotional situation, as he noted he had spoken with so many of Leslie's friends and family, he felt like he knew her. Unfortunately, while it was a worthy effort and a shot worth taking, the scrapings did not contain enough DNA to make a positive match. Unfortunately, it seems, this is where the case has come once again to a grinding stop. Detective Valencia officially retired in 2007, though he continued to note that Leslie's case was the one case which will continue to haunt him until it is solved. Chief Jaffe felt frustrated that they'd gone so far, but couldn't get what they needed, although she maintains her optimism that this case will eventually be solved. In 2018, Chief Jaffe left the NYPD, returning to the place where her career had started, Brooklyn's 75th Precinct. She concluded her career with a retirement speech in which she discussed Leslie's case. She stated, in part, quote, "Tonight, I want to remember her because it is still an unsolved murder. We believe we know who did it, and there are a lot of people who believe he did it, but there's just not probable cause. So let's remember Leslie Zaret, August 17th, 1974. End quote. When last seen, Leslie Sue Zaret was described as a Caucasian female with dark hair and eyes, standing 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighing approximately 105 pounds. Leslie was 17 years old in August of 1974 when she disappeared after leaving her friend's home, located at 148 18 58th Street. Her destination was 26 blocks away, or approximately 1.5 miles south, to the two-brick family home where she lived at 138 54 68th Drive. She was last seen by witnesses at a bar, located then at 5920 Main Street at approximately 11:35 p.m. 9 hours later, her nude body was found behind PS 203 in the playground area, located at 5311 Springfield Boulevard, more than 6 miles off course from where her walk would have normally taken her. Leslie Zaret was murdered via manual strangulation and was sexually assaulted with a hairbrush. It remains undetermined if the brush belonged to her or her killer. Neatly folded and stacked beside her body were the clothes she had been wearing the night before: a long-sleeved flower print blouse, blue jeans, and beige platform shoes. Jewelry was also recovered from Leslie's body, those being a gold necklace, gold earrings, and 2 gold rings. It is believed she either got into a vehicle willingly or was forced in by her killer, likely along the stretch of Main Street which butts up against Mount Hebron Cemetery. Leslie was just 1 month shy of her 18th birthday, and if alive today, she would be turning 67 this September. Nearly 50 years have passed since Leslie Zaret was abducted, assaulted, and murdered before her killer left her nude body grotesquely posed in the playground of PS 203. While investigators have a suspect, that of Mr. Softy, they do not possess enough information to officially charge him. However, they are certain there are others out there who have been victims of his attacks, as well as others who do possess knowledge of what happened that night in August of 1974. Far too much time has passed, and while Leslie has remained in her grave, her killer has gone on to marry, have children, and build a life he stole from a sweet, kind, petite 17-year-old who couldn't possibly defend herself against his brutal onslaught. The murder of Leslie Zaret is a disturbing, frustrating, and heartbreaking case. Whenever a terrible crime like this goes unsolved, it leaves in its wake a devastated family, mourning friends, and a painful grief which can never be assuaged. Even though we often think of crimes like this in terms of justice, in terms of closure, there's never really any closure when you've lost your daughter, your sister, or your best friend. While everyone who knew and loved Leslie desperately wants to see her killer arrested, charged, and convicted, the small respite that offers can never stand up against the heart-wrenching nightmare from which they can never awaken. There's not a large list of theories when it comes to Leslie's murder. In fact, according to investigators, they believe full well that they know who was responsible. They simply lack enough evidence to grant probable cause for a warrant. No eyewitness testimony can place him at the scene or in Leslie's company. Apparently, no DNA captured is enough to generate a stronger profile to officially link him to this atrocious and horrendous crime. While Leslie has laid in her grave for nearly 49 years, her killer has lived his life, married, divorced, had children. He's gone on vacations, partied with friends, and lived life by his own terms. All of the freedom he has is in direct contrast to everything he stole from a 17-year-old woman who just wanted to get home. Normally, we go through all the different theories in a case, but that's hard to do when there aren't really any. Sure, there's debate about who might have been responsible. Someone Leslie knew, or a complete stranger, maybe Mr. Softy, but there's not enough information to really dig in deep. Could Leslie have been lured into a trap by someone she knew? Sure. Might she have gone along with someone and when he began making advances, she rejected him and everything went sideways? Certainly a possibility. Could a total stranger have talked her into his car or forced her in as she tried to escape? Again, you can't rule anything out. In fact, that last question is very close to what investigators believe actually happened. So, since there isn't a ton for us to analyze here, it seems most rational to examine what we know about Softy and how his previous crime ties into Leslie's. Most of what we know about Softy comes from a handful of sources: the woman he raped 2 weeks before Leslie's murder, a woman he was dating at the time, and 5 other women who had violent or abusive encounters with him. According to his first known rape victim, she met him at a Manhattan club, and he ultimately convinced her to give him a ride back to Queens. Once in the borough, Softy and her stop at a 24-hour diner located less than 2 miles from Leslie's home and the location near Mount Hebron Cemetery where they believe she was abducted. He then leads his first victim to Cunningham Park in Fresh Meadows, again, less than 2 miles from where Leslie's body is later found. When you lay out all of the known locations on a map, From the home of Laura Gold to the bar on Main Street, to the cemetery, to Leslie's home, to the 24-hour diner, Cunningham Park, and PS 203, what you'll find is that Leslie's planned path home that night is just slightly to the east of the diner, and the location of her body was just north of Cunningham Park. Queens is a massive borough home to more than 2 million residents in 1974. What are the chances that another rapist outside of Softy would be stalking the same area and committing his crimes with the same MO? I'm certainly not one to rule out all possibilities, but I'm also not a huge believer in coincidence, at least not when all available information seems to rationalize that out of the picture. In the first attack, for which Softy would later serve 17 months in state prison, he lures his victim to a quiet and secluded spot. Once alone, he lashes out, knocking her to the ground and ripping off her clothes. Unable to maintain an erection, he forces her onto her stomach and sodomizes her with her own comb. This violating, brutal act seemingly gets him going, as moments later, he has an erection and begins raping the victim. All throughout the assault, he's tightening his hands around her throat, and had she not managed to escape, there's a good chance she wouldn't have come out alive. 2 weeks later, to the day, Leslie goes missing and is later found stripped nude with her clothing neatly stacked beside her. While no evidence is found to confirm rape, there's obvious sexual assault as the hairbrush is found inside of her at the scene, where her killer crudely and cruelly posed her with her legs partially opened. Outside of a few scratches on her throat, there's no trauma to the body, leading investigators to believe that the killer strangled the victim either before attempting the assault or perhaps attacked the smaller woman too aggressively, killing her before he could rape her. There's a lot of questions lingering about what happened after. Did the killer lead Leslie to that playground and attack there? Or did the crime take place elsewhere, with the killer choosing to bring Leslie's body to that playground, where he posed her, stacked her clothes, and left one hideous insult with that hairbrush? For Detective Valencia, he thought that this was a message from the killer, almost as if he was saying, I had to do this because the other one got away. It may have also been a taunt, perhaps aimed not at the police, but at his first victim. He hadn't yet gone to trial nor entered his guilty plea, and some have theorized that this crime may have been about sending a message. The first victim hears about the hairbrush, and now she knows this guy is capable of murder. Thankfully, it didn't work, and he ended up serving 17 months in state prison, a penalty that I find so flimsy and weak that it's a slap to the face of anyone who has ever been the victim of sexual assault. It's difficult to ignore the similarities, but there are some differences. In the first attack, Softy tears the clothes from his victim's body. In Leslie's case, her clothes are in good condition and left neatly folded beside her. In the first attack, he sodomizes the victim with her own comb. In Leslie's case, it appears the hairbrush was forced into her vagina and doesn't appear to have been done in order to get his erection working. It seems almost like an afterthought, and I can't help but wonder if, after putting that brush in, maybe the killer might have masturbated, either there, at the playground, or elsewhere where the crime was actually committed. In regard to where the crime was committed, detectives are pretty certain it wasn't the playground. Remember, this is an area where residents had been complaining for months that groups of teenagers were gathering together, making lots of noise, drinking, smoking pot, hooking up, and partying. So then, what are the chances that this crime would have been committed there on a Friday night, sometime between 11:30 and say 2 a.m., and nobody saw anything and nobody heard anything? I think the most poignant question to ask is, what kind of a moron would try to commit this crime in the midst of all that chaos? I tend to agree with detectives that the crime occurred elsewhere, or Leslie was held for a period of time before she was brought to that playground and left. Several people, from local residents to the custodian Saul Remph, believed that the killer had to have been familiar with the location. There were only a few ways into that playground. One was a gate, which was locked at the end of the day. The other was through a long and convoluted path through the wooded area of Alley Pond Park. After walking along this path, which inclines and has a lot of overgrowth, the killer would have come face to face with the chain link fence surrounding the playground. For the record, This isn't your normal 4 or 5 foot fence, but it's extended up higher, towering over the playground at around 15 feet. Certainly not the kind of situation where someone could easily carry a body over. However, those familiar with the area would know that approximately 50 feet from where that wooded path is, there's a hole cut in the fence. On the other end of the yard, along Springfield Boulevard, there were several more holes cut into the fence. Rationally, it makes a lot more sense that the killer entered via Springfield, especially if Leslie was already dead. Police reported no signs of drag marks in the nearby woods, no notes of marks on her body which would suggest she was dropped from the height of the fence, and no references to dirt, soil, or other stains on her body, especially in places likely to have gotten dirty where someone dragging her, like the heels of her feet, the backs of her legs, or perhaps her back entirely. This, of course, also raises the possibility that while the crime could have been committed by just one person, the dumping of the body might have involved an additional set of hands. So here's the big question. Why put her body there at all? Had she been killed at a different, more isolated location, it seems that it would have made more sense to leave her there where maybe she wouldn't be discovered so quickly. I can't help but wonder if Cunningham Park, where the first victim was taken, might have been the spot Leslie was ultimately taken. You're talking a distance of no more than 1.8 miles from the park to where Leslie's body's recovered. Could this move have been done to destroy the connection between the two cases? That's a possibility, but it very much feels like the insertion of the hairbrush is a direct reference to the previous crime. So there, you have a bit of cognitive dissonance, moving the body, stacking the clothes, and posing her in a place where there was a guarantee she'd be found. That doesn't sound like what you do if you're trying to avoid being caught, but definitely what someone might do to send a message, or if they believed they're not going to be caught. Now again, as I made reference to earlier, this was a busy spot that drew in a ton of the local teenagers. It wouldn't have been easy to carry Leslie's body past all of those people without being noticed, which again suggests that whoever killed Leslie did not place her body in that playground until the very early morning hours, perhaps sometime between, say, 4 and 7 a.m. If you take Laura Gold's home, the bar on Main Street, Mount Hebron Cemetery, the 24-hour diner, Cunningham Park, and PS 203, you'll find that all of these places fall inside of an area less than 4.5 square miles. That's a pretty tight area for the biggest borough in New York. And just for the record, Queens spans a total of 108.1 square miles. So somehow, these two very similar, very disturbing crimes occur within 2 weeks of one another, with the scenes no more than 2 miles apart, all inside of a tight 4.5 square mile area? See what I mean about coincidences? We know from Detective Valencia that Softy not only raped victim number 1, but that he was physically and sexually abusive to other women he dated and spent time around. Hell, his girlfriend in 1974 tells police that he showed up at her house the night Leslie was murdered, smelling of human waste. Valencia notes that when someone is killed by manual strangulation, their bowels will often evacuate. Is this solid evidence that can be utilized to confirm Softy's involvement? Unfortunately, not by a long shot, but it's a piece of the puzzle. And when you add everything together that we know about this monster, it paints a hell of a picture. Sadly, that picture is very circumstantial. Even if you eliminate Leslie from consideration and you focus only on the first victim, I find it extremely difficult to accept the possibility that this guy wouldn't have struck again. In 1974, he's 21 years old, living with his family on Long Island. Already, he's committed a brutal and violent sexual assault, and maybe he's gotten a taste for it. There's a big part of me that struggles to accept that the woman we refer to as his first victim truly was his first. It seems unlikely that he figured out in that moment that sodomizing his victim with a comb is what he needed to get himself excited. Even if he hadn't overtly sexually assaulted a woman before, it seems likely he's utilized objects to sodomize or penetrate women in the past and probably continues to do so in the future. Seemingly, this act is tied to his ability to perform sexually. At the time, when investigators noticed the hairbrush at Leslie's scene, they came to one conclusion. Perhaps the killer has some form of erectile dysfunction and the brush was used as a surrogate for his actual penis. We've seen this in other cases. Oftentimes, the killer, for reasons unknown, cannot elicit the sexual response he desires, and so he utilizes another object to carry out the crime for him. Certainly, that could have happened here, and I find it incredibly difficult to accept that it's mere coincidence that Softy performs his first attack in this exact way, and then someone else in the same 4.5 square mile area does the same thing, except this time they kill the victim. Leslie is believed to have been abducted from near Mount Hebron Cemetery, which is 1.4 miles northwest from the 24-hour diner where Softy went with victim number 1. Leslie's body is found at PS 203, 1.7 miles northeast of Cunningham Park, where Softy took victim number 1. That's a hell of a lot of coincidences. Unfortunately, investigators need more to move forward. In 1974, DNA wasn't something detectives were on the lookout for, so however the hairbrush was handled seemingly damaged whatever sample they might have been able to obtain. After the exhumation of Leslie's body, fingernail scrapings are acquired, and while DNA is found, it's simply not enough to develop a full profile. So, detectives find themselves back to square one, trying to investigate a nearly 50-year-old sexual assault and murder without a major piece of evidence. They go back 30 years later and interview Softy, who seemingly gets agitated and wants to leave. He quickly hires a lawyer and won't speak to investigators about the case, claiming that he wasn't involved in any way. Now, I don't like to speculate broadly. I prefer to operate in terms of what can and cannot be proven, what is or is not likely. However, I can't help but wonder about this guy. I know everyone loves to submit whatever possible suspect they have as a potential solution to the question of who is the Long Island serial killer. There's a big part of me that wonders what Softy might know about those crimes. He's lived on Long Island, he targeted women, sexually assaulted them, and then attempted to kill them via manual strangulation. Now, obviously, there's no solid evidence to link Softy to the Lisk murders, but there sure seems to be some interesting similarities. I can assure you, over the coming months, I'm going to be digging real deep into Softy's life in search of anything I can find that might help illuminate Leslie's case and maybe others which have never been connected to him. Suffice it to say, I find it highly unlikely this guy served his 17 months and never committed a crime like this again. Unfortunately, though, this is where we hit the wall. Not enough evidence to charge, not enough evidence to confirm, not enough information to unlock new avenues, and not enough information to really pin Softy to anything outside of the crime for which he's already served time. The answers are out there. Someone knows more about this case than they're sharing, either because they were involved or because, for reasons unknown, they're protecting Softy. Sadly, I acknowledge there's also a good chance there are other victims out there, perhaps ones who managed to survive or who Softy, for one reason or another, chose not to or failed to kill. I can't begin to imagine the horrors this man must have put these women through, but I truly hope that if there is someone out there who finds these details disturbingly similar to something they or someone they know was subjected to, they may hold additional information which could finally break this case open. Victim number 1 didn't share the full story of her rape for more than 30 years because of the pain and trauma. How many others might be out there struggling to put their lives and themselves back together because of the heinous and grotesque actions of this absolute monster? Only time will tell. So, this is where the case sits. Leslie Zaret lies in her grave in West Babylon, nearly 50 years later, and still no answers have been provided, no charges have been brought, no names released, no arrests made. Given the passage of time, the lack of physical evidence, and the inability to conclusively link anyone to Leslie's murder, the only way to help bring this monster to justice lies in you. Someone out there listening right now, someone who knows more, someone who is afraid they might know more. I can't pretend I understand how difficult it must be, but unless someone comes forward or new evidence is miraculously discovered, the murder of Leslie Zaret will remain open, unsolved, and once again, growing cold. If you're looking for more information about the murder of Leslie Zaret, there are many newspaper archives available which detail her story. The most helpful for this episode were both the New York Daily News and the New York Post. I would also highly recommend the Daily Beast article, which I sourced in this episode, which digs deep into the case and covers much of the 30 years that passed between her murder and the reinvestigation by cold case detectives. If you have any information at all about the murder of Leslie Zaret, or you believe you may have had an encounter with the man referred to as Mr. Softy, please contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-577-TIPS. That's 1-800-577-8477. You can provide information completely anonymously. A $12,000 reward is currently available for information leading to an arrest and conviction. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. If you or someone you love has been the victim of sexual assault, there are resources available to assist you. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is available 24 hours a day, and their trained staff can offer resources and help put you in contact with a local sexual assault service provider in your area. You can call the hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. You can also visit the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network at RAINN.org. That's RAINN.org. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Camelia Tyler, Christine Greco, Danny Renee, Daerthy, Denise Dingsdale, Diane Dyson, Eloanne Meyer, Fabulous TT, Guilherme Pinto, Jennifer Winkler, Julie A. Mangano, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Madison LaHoulier, Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Shores, Sarah Lyons, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tiffany Nelson, and Tom Radford. Without your amazing support, this show would not be possible, so thank you all so much for contributing to Trace Evidence. One quick reminder, if you're planning on attending CrimeCon this year in Orlando, Florida, use promo code TRACE at crimecon.com to save 10% off your pass. Once again, that's promo code TRACE at crimecon.com. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes our look into the 1974 murder of 17-year-old Leslie Zaret, at least for now. I want to thank you all again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.